Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jeremy Loeffler, and I work in the Policy Office in the Division of Institution and Award Support at the National Science Foundation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar in our series, which will cover individual and organizational eligibility for NSF funding opportunities. We are happy and excited that you can join us today, and we hope you enjoy today's webinar. I'm now pleased to present our speaker, Gene Feldman, who heads the Policy Office at the National Science Foundation.
Well, thanks, Jeremy, and welcome to the second edition of the NSF Policy Office webinar series of 2023. As part of this webinar, I will be discussing the very important issue of eligibility, both from the perspective of organizational eligibility to individual eligibility. The language in this section of the PAP guide had remained virtually unchanged, with a few exceptions, over the past several decades. In the past few PAP guide issuance, however, we've attempted to improve the clarity regarding our requirements, and I'm going to heavily emphasize that as I go through this particular presentation. Next slide, please. Well, my name is Gene Feldman, and I am head of the Policy Office in the Division of Institution and Award Support in the Office of Budget, Finance, and Award Management. And I am very fortunate to have Mr. Jeremy Loeffler help me with the outreach that we run for all of the Office of Budget, Finance, and Award Management. So we're very excited that all of you are here today with us. Next slide, please. So as part of today, I mentioned that I was covering organizational eligibility and individual eligibility, but I'm going to be going into some more detail. So what will I be covering as part of today's webinar? Organizational eligibility and the categories of proposers that are eligible to submit proposals to the National Science Foundation. I'm also going to cover the types of eligibility limitations that sometimes appear in program solicitations, giving you a high level of what those types are, as well as what are some examples of each of those types of eligibility that you may see in an NSF program solicitation. I'm going to cover other types of proposals with eligibility criteria. And then finally, we're going to end with some very important opportunities for Q&A so we can hear what your questions are about this very, very important issue. Next slide, please. So, eligibility and organizational eligibility. So if you take one thing away from this webinar, please let it be this. Unless it's specified in the PAP guide, and I'm going to give you the two examples as part of this presentation that do not fall under this, the eligibility requirements specified in Chapter 1 of the PAP guide apply to the prime organization submitting the proposal only. They do not apply to NSF subawardees or consultants identified. We are continually asked the question of whether these eligibility categories also apply to subawardees, and so both internally and externally. And so I wanted to make sure that all of you were aware of what the responses were to that. Secondly, and I'm going to go into this more later in the presentation, but any solicitation can modify the general eligibility requirements that are specified in the PAP guide. So if there are limitations specified, those limitations will be enforced as part of the initial compliance checks conducted on the proposal. And we do review those eligibility requirements when the document comes in for clearance before it is posted to the NSF website. So I wanted to make those two overarching points before I actually get into the details. So one of the most recent changes in the eligibility coverage in the PAP guide was to divide eligibility into two sections. organizations that are eligible and organizations that may be eligible. The organizations that are eligible to submit a proposal are identified on this slide. And the first is, of course, institutions of higher education, both 2- and 4-year institutions of higher education, to be precise. And I will tell you, by far, institutions of higher education are our largest proposer category, as well as our largest awardee category. But let me also talk about another piece of institutions of higher education that we do address in the PAP guide. And that has to do with international branch campuses of higher education. And we have some very specific guidance on when an international branch campus of a U.S. institution of higher education, and this is one of those exceptions, including through use of subawards and consultant arrangements, what they must do in order to submit that proposal. The proposer has to explain the benefits to the project of performance at the international branch campus, and very importantly, justify why the project activities cannot be performed at the U.S. campus. That information has to be included in the project description. In addition, there is a box that you will check on the cover sheet to apprise NSF and, frankly, any parts of the review process that there is funding of an international branch campus of a US IHE proposed for this particular proposal. So very important, that action has to be taken. And the entire review process will take a look at that from the very beginning when it's assigned to a program officer, through the review process, through our Office of International Science and Engineering, and finally with the Division of Grants and Agreements before they make those awards. The next category of proposers is nonprofit, non-academic organizations. And those are your museums, your observatories, your research laboratories, professional societies, and similar organizations of that type. And that category is our second largest type of organization that we deal with at the National Science Foundation. We also, in the 2023 version of the PAP guide, added a new category of eligibility, and that had to do with tribal governments. We have since changed our terminology, and we are calling them tribal nations. And there is a definition in the PAP guide of what qualifies as this type of organization. And I should note that this is separate and distinct from the organizations that propose to our Tribal College and University program, or TICA. These are the actual tribal nations themselves that are submitting proposals. So next slide, please. So we have now developed this second category of eligibility because each of the organizational types that are identified on this slide really have parameters identified on when they are available or eligible to submit a proposal to NSF. So to have lumped them all together and say, all of you are eligible, but then put some of these parameters, we felt that might be confusing. So we've now established this second category, organizations that may be eligible to submit proposals. The first is for-profit organizations. And this eligibility language was definitely revised in the 2023 version of the PAP guide to improve the clarity on when for-profit organizations may be eligible to submit proposals to NSF. We added language, for example, that is particularly relevant to our Technology, Innovation, and Partnership Directorate, NSF, which in the language specifically states NSF is interested in supporting projects that couple industrial use-inspired technologies and resources with those of IHEs. Therefore, the Foundation especially welcomes proposals for cooperative projects involving both IHEs and industry. And you saw that in the first solicitation issued by the TIP Directorate, the Research Innovation Engines. Specific funding opportunities also may make for-profit organizations eligible for submission of proposals to NSF. And I should note that we had added language in the 23 version that specifically stated that US-based affiliates or subsidiaries of foreign organizations must contact the cognizant NSF program officer prior to preparing and submitting that proposal to NSF. So if you are a for-profit organization or you as an institution of higher education deal with for-profit organizations in putting together or in collaborating on those proposals, I would very much encourage you to reread that for-profit organization eligibility language. The next type of eligibility that I'd like to mention is state and local governments. Now, state and local governments, the language also changed in the 2023 version of the PAP guide. And the reason that it changed is that state and local governments is the one entity type that is not actually mentioned in the NSF Act of 1950. So previously, we encouraged state and local governments to collaborate with an institution of higher education when there was interest in submitting a proposal. So the language has been revised to call it out and say, and give the foundation greater flexibility by saying, as programmatically necessary and identified in a program solicitation. So the program solicitation in the eligibility section would have to specifically call out state and local governments as being eligible to submit proposals to NSF. Foreign organizations. NSF rarely, as a matter of policy, provides direct funding support to foreign organizations. NSF will consider proposals for cooperative projects involving US and foreign organizations, provided that support is requested only for the US portion of the collaborative effort. So typically, and for many years, if there was a collaboration, the collaborating organization in the foreign country would go to their science funding agency, get the funding necessary, and that country would actually pay for that portion of the collaboration, and the US or NSF would pay for the US part of that proposal. So the language was modified a few years ago to specify that if there were cases where the proposer considers a foreign organization or foreign individuals' involvement to be essential to the project and proposes to provide funding through the US budget and through the NSF budget, and this is the second case where it does apply to a subaward or consultant arrangement, the proposer has to justify the benefit to the US research and education. And there are things that will need to be covered in the project description, such as why the support from the foreign counterparts in-country resources is not feasible, why you couldn't make that arrangement with that to have the other host country pay, why the foreign organization or foreign individual can carry out the project, again, more effectively than a US organization or US individual. What unique expertise, organizational capability, facilities, data, access to a geographic location not generally available to U.S. investigators, the foreign organization or foreign individual can bring to the project, and finally, what significant science and engineering education, training, or research opportunities the foreign organization or foreign individual offers to the U.S. Now, this may seem like a lot, and it may seem like we're asking for a lot of information, but that's the bottom line, that we typically do not fund foreign organizations. So such information has to be included in the project description, including that I just mentioned, new and renewal proposals. And the project description, again, is the appropriate location to put that information. There is also a box that you will need to check on the proposal cover sheet for funding of a foreign organization or foreign individual, if that project includes funding for that foreign organization or foreign individual. It is, as I mentioned, with the international branch campuses of U.S. Institutions of higher education, this information that is provided as part of the project description is considered by the entire review process. Everything from the individual program officer that receives that proposal to the merit review through the panel or ad hoc reviewers. It's also reviewed by the Office of International Science and Engineering, and then finally through our Division of Grants and Agreements to make sure that all the particular requirements have been met. Now I'm going to talk about the final category of entity that we're going to be referring to as other federal agencies. Under unusual circumstances, federal agencies and FFRDCs may submit proposals directly to NSF. A proposed project is only eligible for support if it meets one or more of the exceptions that are identified in the PAP guide. And it has to be determined in advance of proposal submission by a cognizant NSF program officer. Well, what are these categories? A special project. And what's included under special projects? Under exceptional circumstances, research or education projects at other federal agencies or FFRDCs may be eligible when they make unique contributions to the needs of researchers elsewhere or to other NSF, specific NSF objectives, may be eligible for support. National and international programs. The foundation may fund research and logistical support activities of other government agencies or FFRDCs that are directed at meeting the goals of special national and international research programs for which the foundation does bear special responsibility. An example of that is the U.S. Antarctic Research Program. And finally, the third category are international travel awards, and those are to help ensure appropriate representation or availability of a particular expertise at an international conference. We may fund staff researchers of other federal agencies for NSF International Travel Awards. So again, if the proposer thinks that they meet one of the exceptions specified in the PAP guide, they have to contact and get approval from the cognizant NSF program officer before they actually go and submit that proposal. Next slide, please. Unaffiliated individuals. There is no way for an individual to meet the federal funding requirements that are specified in 2 CFR 200. And those are the federal-wide requirements from management of federal funds. So unaffiliated individuals are not eligible to submit proposals to NSF. We do encourage that if these individuals have that amazing idea that they still believe warrants funding, we encourage these individuals to affiliate with an institution of higher education to submit that proposal. Now, as noted here, a postdoctoral fellow submitting as an individual to a postdoc fellowship program is not considered an unaffiliated individual. And that's not what we meant by are not eligible to submit proposals to NSF. Per the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, individuals that are a party to a malign foreign talent recruitment program also will not be eligible to serve as a senior key person on a proposal beginning with the effective date of the next version of the PAP guide. I wanted to state this out loud. It's a statutory requirement. It is not in place now, but I want you to prepare for it because it will be in effect for the 2024 version of the PAP guide. This will not be retroactive, and NSF will be providing a lot of outreach on the implications of malign foreign talent recruitment programs as we do our outreach on the 2024 version of the PAP guide. Next slide, please. I also mentioned when I started that program solicitations themselves may actually include eligibility limitations. And so we got together, and Ann Doyle, who runs the clearance process for the policy office, and Jeremy, they came up with some examples of the kinds of things for each of these that you might see in a funding opportunity. So there may be limitations on organizational eligibility. In other words, it may be restricted to a specific type of organization. Well, what are some examples of that? The Historically Black College and University Undergraduate Program, HBCU UP. It's been around at NSF for a very long time. Well, that solicitation specifically specifies that it has to be submitted by a historically Black college or university. So that's an example of organizational eligibility. Our postdoc programs, they will indicate whether the proposal is submitted by an individual or a host institution. And so we encourage you, whenever you're looking at that postdoc programs, to see about that particular aspect of eligibility. Another example of solicitation eligibility and limitations are limits on PI eligibility. This is when they specifically put parameters on when an individual can serve as a PI and whether it also applies to co-PIs or other senior project personnel or senior key persons. Examples of these include our Centers of Research Excellence in Science and Technology, our CREST centers, as we call them. And in this particular solicitation, it specifies that the PI must hold a full-time faculty appointment at the institution submitting the proposal. Another example, Partnerships for Innovation, PFI. It has very, very detailed PI and co-PI eligibility. For example, it requires an industrial partner co-PI. So again, that's why we put these summary documents up front in the solicitation, so you're easily able to see what kind of limitations may be in place for that particular solicitation. Another example are limitations on the number of proposals submitted per organization. An example of this is our Major Research Instrumentation, or MRI program. That solicitation limits the number of proposals that can be submitted to the different tracks identified in the solicitation. Please note that there are specialized instructions for branch campuses that are eligible in the MRI solicitation. Please take a look at that, because that may differ from another solicitation that has limitations on when a branch campus is included in the number of proposals or is outside the number of proposals. And again, this varies by solicitation. So please be careful to read this language very carefully. We also look at this particular limitation very closely as part of the review process. Why? Because we know it is sometimes very, very difficult for you to be able to pick between a proposal from mathematics to a proposal from engineering or computer science or social, behavioral, and economic sciences. So for this particular category, where we limit the number of proposals per organization, we do review this language very carefully as part of the review process. Another example, limits on number of proposals per PI. It may restrict the number of proposals or subawards that a PI, co-PI, or in some cases, other senior personnel may be associated with. The number of proposals in a specified date range, or a total number of submissions over a period of time, such as a PI or co-PI's career. An example of that is, of course, one of our largest and most visible programs, the Faculty Early Career Development Program, or CAREER. You can only submit one proposal per competition and may not participate in more than 3 competitions total. This solicitation also has very detailed eligibility information. So again, that's one you definitely want to make sure that you read the language very carefully. And then, of course, there are always solicitation-specific eligibility criteria that are based on the actual mission or what they're trying to achieve in that particular solicitation. So I wanted to make you aware of that as well. If you have any questions regarding whether you as a faculty member or your organization are eligible to submit a proposal, these questions should be directed to the cognizant program staff identified in the solicitation. They are the ones that crafted that particular language to meet the specific needs and mission of that particular funding opportunity. And those are the individuals that will ultimately make the decision regarding whether you're eligible or not. So that's a very important third takeaway message that you should be aware of as you're reviewing NSF solicitations or the PAP guide and thinking about preparing a proposal. Next slide, please. Other types of proposals with eligibility criteria. So we do in the PAP guide itself have in the other types of proposal section, and that's PAP guide chapter 2F, there are particular types of proposals that do restrict eligibility. For example, grant opportunities for academic liaison with goalie. It has to be submitted by an institution of higher education, and it must include an industrial co-PI. However, they may not receive funding on the award except for a small business that meets the specific criteria that are outlined in the PAP guide. Facilitation awards for scientists and engineers with disability. We call those FACED. These are persons with disabilities are eligible for FACED awards, include PIs, other senior personnel, and graduate and undergraduate students. Finally, our career life balance supplemental funding requests. The research award recipients can request to support additional personnel, such as a technician or research assistant, while the PI, co-PI, or other senior personnel is on family leave. Postdoctoral fellowships can request CLB supplements, but it is provided that the award is made to an organization and not those awards that are made directly to the individual. And finally, GRFP, or our Graduate Research Fellowship Program, recipients can request support to sustain research during a medical deferral. Next slide, please. So now we are going to move to the question and answer portion of the webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy to help field the questions. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you, Jean. Thank you for the presentation. And we have been getting, just actually in the last couple minutes, a bunch of more questions coming in. So we're looking at those. And I've been trying to kind of group these along certain themes here. So I think what I'd like to do is start out by talking about, we had some initial questions about nonprofit, non-academic organizations with respect to research laboratories. And what do we mean when we say research laboratories? Does that include, for example, a Department of Energy national laboratory?
Yes, and we actually address that issue in the actual text of other federal agencies and specifically identify that if it is a DOE national lab, which is an FFRDC, and many of them are, they are considered an other federal agency and therefore would be required to comply with the limitations that we impose. As I mentioned, there are pretty significant ones on other federal agencies, the concept being that they are already given funding to do research, and therefore we don't want to be paying them twice when they've already received appropriated funds. So that has to do with the FFRDC portion. If there is another a specific funding opportunity that addresses the question of laboratories, but you're not sure if your laboratory fits in with that, that would be an absolute appropriate question to approach the cognition program officer to ensure that you are meeting the eligibility requirements of that particular solicitation, because it could get pretty detailed in terms of an assessment that would have to be made. One other final comment on that is that some of our geosciences solicitations may specifically make just NSF FFRDCs be eligible, so you need to stay tuned for that when you're looking at those particular solicitations.
Okay, I want to move to international branch campuses of U.S. institutions of higher education. And one of the questions that we had was, do all of the proposal requirements for an international branch campus apply if there is no funding that is actually going to that international branch campus? I'm really happy that it has been a question that was asked, because it is a very good one, and it's a little nuanced. The bottom line is that what we're trying to get is to actual funding of the international branch campus, meaning, and you saw the two places where we were actually applying our eligibility requirements to subawards or consultant arrangements, and they're in the foreign space is where both of those exist. So what we're trying to determine is to ensure that we take a look at those NSF funds that would be dedicated to in this case, an international branch campus. So when the question asks, if there is no funding that is going to the international branch campus,
then that would not be the requirements imposed would not apply here, because what we're trying to get to is the actual funding of the international branch campus.
Okay, the next question comes under the individual eligibility, and we had a question asking if a foreign student comes to the United States and is studying at a U.S. institution, can they be hired on an NSF-funded project?
Well, this actually is eligibility and it's not eligibility, but because we get this question so very often, I wanted to take the opportunity to go ahead and make it clear, because we do get this question a lot. And the bottom line is that if an international student is coming to your campus, they have all of the appropriate documentation in place to be studying in the US, and you put them on your budget, that would be acceptable. NSF does not apply citizenship requirements to being eligible for funding unless we specify it, and that is rare. What we're typically talking about are our NSF fellowship programs, which by statute are dedicated to US citizens, permanent residents, or nationals. Things like REU that also have statutory requirements on eligibility. But beyond that, if the student is legally here on your campus, has the appropriate documentation, which we don't look at, the institution does, you may put them on an NSF budget for funding.
Okay, we had a lot of questions that seem to be touching around a similar topic of, and a lot of people use the term branch campuses, but I think it would make sense to discuss how NSF regards submitting organizations, right? Like, when are you considered a single organization? When can an organization that might have multiple SAM identifying numbers be able to submit to a solicitation that limits the number of proposals that an institution can submit?
What we're really getting to here, and these, and when NSF, and the time this issue comes up, frankly, is when there are limitations on the number of proposals that can be submitted by an organization. So folks say, okay, what does it mean by an organization? And we actually have different language depending on the solicitation. For example, MRI has language on this eligibility issue. REU has separate language on this issue. But what we're really trying to get to is there's a place where the research is often performed. So you may have, and often this appears in a system. So you may have, and this appears for many, many different institutions across the US, Texas A&M, Rutgers, Penn State, New Jersey. There are just many, many institutions that will have one organization that serves as the organization that submits the proposal, manages it fiscally, and also submits and signs that proposal and makes sure all of the associated award administration requirements are met. And so what we're trying to achieve, and based on programmatic purpose, and that's why the language is sometimes different from solicitation to solicitation, we're really trying to address that issue of the limitation on the number of proposals that may be submitted. The REU language is very detailed. The Research Opportunity Awards for primarily undergraduate institutions, which has very detailed requirements on when those can be submitted. So there isn't one standard answer, but what we are trying to address is, when is an organization the organization that we have to count in order to assess whether or not you've reached that limitation? And so again, the language, due to programmatic purpose, so by definition, it's not standardized for many reasons. but we need to make sure that we assess that an organization has not gone above, based on what program believes is appropriate for that number of proposals that can be submitted. That's when it comes up most frequently. Like I said, the REU is a little different in that it's trying to get to the organizations that could submit. But I really want folks to pay, because there were so many questions about this around this theme. And that's why I use the word branch. So it could be an institution that cannot submit proposals on their own, but they may award their own degrees. And so you have to look at the language in that solicitation in order to identify whether or not you are eligible or not, or whether NSF needs to make that assessment of whether you have gone over the number of proposals that you could submit for a given competition.
Yeah, I think that answers a lot of the questions that people had put in around that topic. I have a couple of questions here that I'm seeing about really where an institution might decide who is eligible to be on an NSF, a proposal to NSF. So we have a question asking, can part-time faculty be a co-PI or a PI on an NSF? But I guess maybe talk a little bit about how NSF views this in terms of institutions making that determination.
Typically, NSF would leave that decision to the institution to determine. However, there is a caveat to that. Obviously, what NSF is interested in is does the individual, based on what they're doing, have the capacity to carry out what they are intending to do. So if they are only a part-time faculty member, that would weigh into that decision as to whether they actually have the capacity to carry out that research as proposed. So typically, NSF provides broad flexibility to have you identify those that are going to serve as senior/key individuals on a proposal submitted to NSF. And we give broad flexibility in identifying those. So unless there is something very specific to that issue, where there is, again, something that we would have to be making some sort of assessment on capacity or ability to carry out that project, that is a decision that we have made, that we allow to be made by the institution.
So I think we've touched on most of the themes that have come up in the questions. I don't know, is there anything, Jean, that you wanted to add to
there
this?
was only one thing, and it had to do with the question, as I believe it was asked, on an unaffiliated individual. And can an institution just send in something saying that they have an affiliation with that particular individual, and therefore they become eligible? The way that would actually work out is that that institution or organization would have to submit the proposal on behalf of that individual. So sending something separate to us and saying, yeah, we vouch that they're affiliated, that would not cut it. They would have to actually submit that proposal on behalf of this individual who they are affiliated with. So I wanted to make swant to make sure that we got that addressed. But
okay,
that's about it.
Thank you, Jean. I want to think we've answered the questions that we currently have. I do want to thank you for joining us today. We are going to put in the chat a link to a survey so that we can get your feedback. We really appreciate your responses, as these survey results will help us shape future content. If you would like to view the recording of this session, you will find it on the Policy Outreach website and on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. I also finally do want to remind everyone that we are planning the next virtual NSF Grants Conference, which is scheduled to run December 4th through 7th. So if you haven't done so already, please visit nsfpolicyoutreach.com to sign up and receive email notifications about that event and about other upcoming events. That way you'll be in the know. So I want to thank you for joining and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.